Hello again. This is week 3, and I'm glad to be with you for our Sunday school theme of Sabbath. I'm Nick Detweiler-Stoddard, and I pastor with Washington Mennonite Church in Iowa. Our theme for today, for May 21, if you're following the schedule, is participating in Sabbath. And the primary scripture that talks about that we're exploring for participating in Sabbath is Matthew 12, 1-14. And in this passage, we encounter Jesus and his disciples in two different settings, running into some disagreement, some open conflict even with some of the other religious leaders of his day, of Jesus' day. And they are having an argument about how do you do Sabbath? How do you properly keep the rules of Sabbath? And also it gets at the question of, well, what's Sabbath for anyways? What's its purpose? Some of the focuses for today as you explore this Matthew 12 passage are asking the question, like I just mentioned about what Jesus is doing with his disciples, is exploring the question of what Sabbath is for or how you do it. In the last couple of weeks, and the beginning week, one of the things that Sabbath is a chance to stop, to receive rest, to trust in God's provision for us. So in that instance, from the Ten Commandments, Sabbath is stopping doing, not doing anything at all. And then last week when we talked about Psalm 23, the emphasis was on Sabbath as, again, not us doing something, but us simply being the recipients of something God does. In Psalm 23, God is the one who cares for us. In this passage, on our third week in Matthew 12, the focus has shifted. Now that we have received God's care and we've stopped our doing, now we're invited to turn around and practice Sabbath as something that we do, rather than Sabbath being something where we do nothing, where we stop and rest. Now Jesus is painting a picture in which Sabbath, at its best, is when, in response to God's gifts to us, we respond by doing something, doing good to others. So Jesus gets in a conversation here in this passage, as you'll explore, in which he is confronted for breaking the rules about how to properly keep Sabbath, and he turns around and basically says, starts a conversation of what are these rules for? What are they getting at? I would encourage you to include the passage. The same version is in Mark. We're looking at the Matthew passage, but if you look also at Mark 2, verses 23-27, especially in verse 27 of Mark 2, there's a really helpful phrase of Jesus that's not included here in Matthew that gets at this question of what Jesus is doing. And in that passage from Mark, Jesus says something along the lines of, when confronted about his rule breaking on the Sabbath, he says that Sabbath is for humans and not the other way around, not Sabbath for humanity. Not humans for Sabbath. Basically, what I understand that to mean is that Jesus is saying the purpose of Sabbath is not so that humans can serve its rules. We're not here to help religion, to follow religion for its own sake. Rather, religious rules, laws are here to serve us, to give us the benefits of God's kingdom, to help us receive the good things. And Sabbath is like those other rules as well, that its purpose is for human flourishing. It's here to serve God's people and not the other way around. So if you want to take a look and hold that in contrast, that's Mark 2, verse 27, a different telling of this passage. Your commentator, Dorothy Jean Weaver, in the passage and in your leader guide on page 71-72, names that Jesus does this in other parts of his ministry. In the same book of Matthew, Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, talks about God's kingdom being one in which the rules, the ways of the kingdom are for the blessing of the people. And then he goes on into his teaching, talking about what you have heard it said. He regularly confronts or examines practices and sayings and scriptures and laws. And he says, I didn't come here to throw out those laws. They've kind of gotten off track. They might sometimes be oppressive or may have missed the mark. And I'm not here to just simply say, let's get rid of them. Let's get rid of the Sabbath rules. Instead, in the example we see in Matthew 5 and 6, as Jesus says, I want to return us to the fullest intentions of what those rules, what those laws, what those practices are for. And in this passage in Matthew 12, he's doing that, particularly with Sabbath. Jesus is here to maybe restore some of the original intentions. We talked in the last few weeks, you might have explored how some of the original intention for Sabbath is freedom from oppression, freedom from overwork. It's to receive God's gifts, to do the things that God does. And here Jesus is restoring or filling even fuller the purposes of Sabbath. So one of the things I would encourage you as a response to these passages to break off into groups and take a look at the weekly, daily Bible readings, or as individuals, and respond to each of those right for yourselves, as saying, this passage suggests to me that the true meaning, the fullest meaning, or the purpose of Sabbath is or are, and then come back to the group, and the best way to learn is by teaching others. Say, in this passage I see that God's purposes for Sabbath are this, or is this. And so that's one way of responding to what Jesus is doing here in fulfilling the purposes of Sabbath. Another response, a resource I might suggest for you to take a look at, I mentioned in the first week, is looking up the Bible Project has a video on the Sabbath. They have a whole landing page with a bunch of resources. And if you happen to look at that video the first week, it's a 5-minute video that talks about the purposes of Sabbath, the origins of Sabbath from the Old Testament, from creation and Exodus, all the way through to Jesus. And the last few minutes of that 5-minute video make the connection to what Jesus is doing and how Jesus in his ministry and then in his death and resurrection fill to the fullest the meanings of Sabbath. It's a really good look, and I would encourage you yourselves to go take a look or even show it in class and discuss some of what you see there, what Jesus is doing to fill Sabbath to its fullest. So in ending, I would also name that one of the key themes for what Jesus is doing here is reframing the question, what is Sabbath for? And one of the responses I think I see Jesus doing here is he's saying that Jesus is for the sake of blessing others. In other words, one of the ways we participate in God's gift of Sabbath to us is by responding and doing likewise, by extending or sharing the benefits of Sabbath to those around us. Jesus talks in this passage about doing good and showing mercy as the highest ideals in God's kingdom. And so one way to put Sabbath into practice is to go out and do that to our neighbors, to our family members, to the people around us. So I would respond, I would maybe even end in your group by talking concretely about some ways in which they could share the benefits of Sabbath with the people in their own household and their congregation or the people around them. And commit to going out and putting a couple of those or one of those into practice and coming back the next week and sharing about it. I hope you are blessed in receiving God's rest. I'll see you next week.